Hi there, my name's Bruce Rain from Breakfast Creations, and in this video I'm going to be recapping a Macintosh IIsi power supply. Most of my videos focus on the recapping of logic boards, and that's usually because they're more susceptible to capacitor leakage. But the Macintosh IIsi power supply is an exception to that. These are a shocker. If anything, these are probably more likely to leak than the logic board in a Macintosh IIsi. I would think the number of unrecapped IIsi power supplies that are still working would be very small. Now let's talk precautions. First of all, this is a power supply that connects to mains power. So obviously don't work on it while it's plugged into mains power. Now you need to disconnect it to remove it, so you're not really in any danger of accidentally leaving it plugged in, because you can't get it out if it's plugged in. So, but obviously the very important thing is now once it's out, don't plug it in. We're not going to plug it in until it's all finished recapped and ready to try out. So, because obviously there are a lot of dangers associated with mains power. Things like, you know, changing yourself from an alive person to a dead person. So be super careful. I accept no responsibility if you decide to follow this, but I will try and show you the safest possible way of doing all these things. Another thing is that this does have capacitors in it, quite large capacitors, and they do hold a charge. So even with the power disconnected, there is the chance of getting a nasty shock if you happen to touch the two contacts of a capacitor. Now, the simplest way to get around that is to just leave it for a while to let all those capacitors discharge. You can discharge a capacitor using a resistor, but I would just recommend the easiest thing is once it's all disconnected, just put it aside for a couple of hours and then you'll be safe to go in and use it. So let's start pulling this apart. First thing we need to do is we need to undo this screw here, which is the one right next to the label, and that's pretty straightforward. So out that comes, one screw removed, and then this basically this cover on the top here is kind of latched in at this side. So you just lift up from this side, and then you can see it's sort of hinged at the other end. So we just lift that, and then that comes off nice and easy. Put that to one side. So now we can have a good old look inside at what it looks like. The next thing we need to do is to remove this section here, which is the little power plugs there. And that we do by undoing this screw underneath. So screw number 2, out he comes. And let's just put that screw to one side with that one. Okay, so then this section here just lifts up and out like that. And it's still connected by this cable, but what's really nice about this power supply is that's just a plug, so we can unplug it, get that piece, put him to one side. Hooray. Right, now this board inside here is held on by 2 screws here, and then one screw buried down in this little nest of wires there. So we'll start with the 2 easy ones here and here. So let's just put that there. Number 1. Yeah, out she comes. There we go. There's one. Number 2. There we go. Oop. Now the other one, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to show this on the camera because of the way he's sort of buried in there. He's right down in there. So I'm going to feed my screwdriver in there. This is quite difficult for me to do while I can see it while it's still on camera. So just going to undo that little screw there. Yeah. And out she comes. Okay, so that's the 3 screws holding that board in. So there are 2 more screws that we need to undo in order to remove the board, and they are around on this side here, and that's those there. They're basically just holding a couple of doohickeys onto the side of this sort of metal case of the power supply to use this metal as heat sinks. So the first thing I'll do is I'll undo this one here, and when this one comes out, there's a little metal thing here. Let me just grab a pair of tweezers so I can pull it out. That's a little metal bracket type thing, and that's actually holding that component up against the metal. And then the other is this little guy here. There's a bolt going through there and then a nut there on the other side. So I'll just try and undo that. There we go, undo that. I'm just going to need to hold this nut while I undo it so that it doesn't start spinning as well. Out it comes. All right, so here's my nut and bolt all ready to go. Then I'm just going to lift up this doohickey and feed those back through there just to keep them all together. So just don't want to lose any of these bits. All right, so that's, at this point you should now be able to move the board around quite easily. So we can actually start removing that, but there is one thing that is going to stop that coming out all the way, and that's this plug here. This plug is connected to the board via this little ream of wires here. So we've got to get this out. Now this has got these little lugs on it that are designed to sort of feed in nice and easily, but then they expand to stop them from falling back out again. So you need to get a pair of pliers like this and push this plastic fins of those plugs together to then feed this through the hole. And then we'll do the same with this one. Is my hand in the way totally? There we go. Okay, so let's start feeding this guy out. Yeah. Okay, so we're just going to keep feeding him out. Just get this little bit past there. It's a little bit fiddly, but you know, essentially he will then come out like that. So there's a little plug. As you can see, there's a fair bit of scunge on the inside of this from capacitor leakage. So let's put that case to one side now. And here is the power supply all ready to go. Now, the areas of real problem on this are this little sort of group of capacitors here. And the other is in this little kind of daughter board, which is poking up just here. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but there's this little board that just sort of sticks up right here like that. And it's got two little surface mount electrolytic capacitors on it. So this power supply basically has it coming from two angles. It's got leaky electrolytic surface mount electrolytic capacitors here, and then it's got leaky through-hole electrolytic capacitors along here. Now, when I recap these, I've got cheat sheet. Got my cheat sheet here. It's links to it in the description. I don't replace these two capacitors here. These are these sort of bigger, higher voltage ones, and generally they don't fail. They probably will eventually, but these generally aren't the problem. But every other capacitor on this, I do replace. And even if you flip over here onto the other side, you can actually see there's all this yuck electrolyte leakage there. So it's fairly clear where all that leakage is coming from. It's all coming from up there. So, all right, so the next thing we need to do is remove all of these capacitors. Now, some of them are a little harder than others because you can see they've got this glue on them holding the capacitors in place. But we basically just need to go through and remove all of the solder on all of these pins and then get those capacitors out. And as in one of my earlier recapping videos, I mentioned that one of the things I often do is I look at this side and then I mark out the pins that need to have the solder taken away. I mark them out on the other side of the board, so I can just go through, mark them all out so that they're all marked, and then I can just go and remove them all in one go. It's a lot easier than you know, sort of removing it and then checking, then removing, then checking. So I'm going to mark out all of the pins that need to have the solder removed, and then I'll begin that solder removal process. Okay, so I think that's all of them. I've marked out 10 different capacitors for removal, and while I've been marking them out, I've also been noticing that there's a bit of damage on the board that we're probably going to have to do some repairs as we remove them. But the next thing is to remove the solder. Now, once again, I've discussed this in some of my other videos about removing solder, and there are a few different ways you can do it. One way is using a motorized solder sucking machine, and that sort of works like a soldering iron with a little hole in the tip, and you basically heat the pin and the solder melts, and then it has a mechanical sucker that just or a motorized sucker that just pulls all the solder off, and away you go. They are fairly pricey. So the other option is to use an old solder sucker like this. which you just prime and then press a button and it just sucks the solder through the end here. These work quite well, but they take a bit of practice to get good at them, because when that point happens that the sucker sucks, it actually, you can like bump and you can end up damaging pads, or you can end up sort of sucking pads up through the hole. So these, you know, do work well, but they take some practice. So I think you need to get used to using them and make sure that you're not actually destroying things in the process. So just be wary of using one of those. The third option is to use solder wick, which I have here. And this is just the solder braid, again links sort of in the description, very cheap. And the idea is that this is just braided copper that's got some flux in it, and when you apply heat, this just sucks solder up. And so this is probably the safer method. If you're not too sure, use these. It helps to get rid of all that solder. The other thing is that when you're dealing with really old and crusty pins where the solder's gone all yucky and crunchy, it can be very beneficial to add some new solder before sucking it up. So, but I'll be demonstrating that in this, because I'm sure there'll be a couple like that here. So let's begin. I will be firing up the microscope, and we'll begin the capacitor removal process. All right, so let's have a look here. Now you can see with this particular pin here, we've got quite a bit of white crusty stuff going on around it, and that's obviously corrosion, and I do have some concerns that that pad under there might actually be damaged as well, so we may have to do some fixing there. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is add some new solder, because that looks so bad. So I'll just grab some solder, apply a little bit of heat and some solder, and you can just see how sort of ugly and crunchy this is. Like, I mean, look at all that stuff. It's going all yucky. I think we might need a little bit of flux on there. So let's get some onto there. Flux helps to deal with oxidation, depending on where you're from. And as you can see, that solder started melting a lot easier once I applied it. And let's do the same to this pin here. Just make sure we're in focus. Get some solder onto there. There we go. That is gross. That is awesome, but that is gross. Okay, so now we get our solder wick to suck all that solder up. And just keep going until it's gone. In a situation like this where there's a lot of solder on there, we will go through quite a bit of wick, but it can't be helped. Okay. Now, I'm quite happy with the way that pad's come up, so I think we're all right. Now, it's horrendously awful, but I think if I now reach underneath here and give that capacitor a bit of a tug, it's one of these ones that's stuck on with the glue. So I'm going to try and snap it free. There we go. Okay, so I've snapped it free of the glue, and that now is just coming out of the holes like that. And that, now that it's gone, now the pins are gone, it gives us an opportunity to clean it up a little bit. So I've got some isopropyl alcohol here, and I've got a cotton bud or a Q-tip, and I'm just going to give this a bit of a wipe to clean that up as best as I can. There we go. Now the good news is that there is no damage to these pads. They will they should quite happily take solder when I put the new components in. So that was, I think, probably going to be the hardest one. So let's have a look at, okay, these ones here don't look anywhere near as bad, so they're my little black marks that I put on them. For this I could use a solder sucker. I generally don't use a solder sucker when the pads look ugly, because if they're a bit, they're a bit brittle, you can end up just sort of sucking the whole pad up with it. So again, this is just a demonstration. I'm just going to apply some heat here, wait till all of that gets molten. Actually, I might put it closer into the camera. There we go. So applying the heat there, get all that solder molten, put the tip of the solder sucker there and press the button and it sucks it up. But let's go do the other one. Apply some heat, melting, and then suck. Okay, so that has certainly taken enough solder away that we'll be able to get that capacitor out. Just going to see if I can push it. Once again, a lot of these capacitors are glued on the other side. So when I go to remove them, they don't come out because they're glued to the capacitor next to them. So it does make sense to actually remove all of these first, and then we'll just try and remove them as a great big clump. So once again, we'll go with the solder sucker. And once you've done this a fair bit, you do get very quick at it. There we go. That's enough gone. And all we need is enough solder gone so that we can get that capacitor out. So that is now... So there was a little group in there, a little group of 3 around here, and they are all loose now, and that's come out. So that was the first of the 3 there, and then there's the other 2. So they're all out. So that's good. Now, what I would typically do with this is I would look again cleaning up these pads here. So I've done plenty of videos of cleaning up pads before, so I get a little bit of flux and usually a little bit of fresh solder. And we're just sort of using flux and solder and heat to clean up those pads. And then we get our wick and suck up that solder that we've just put on. Okay. Oop. Come on. There we go. Right, so then once again we get our Q-tip, clean them up, and they're all ready to put some new solder on, so that's great. Alright, so I'm going to now work my way through all of these capacitors. I don't see a need to film all of them because that would just be unbelievably boring. So bear with me while I go and do all this. Okay, so that is 10 capacitors removed. Now, you can clearly see on these capacitors, if I just hold them up, you can clearly see that we've got all sorts of scunge and leaking going on there. I mean, look at that. Look at that. That is not a pretty sight. So, no doubt about the fact that these needed to be changed. So that's fine. And then of course if we have a look at the board as well, I mean, look at that, look at the gunk that's been left behind, and of course that's all going to have to get cleaned off before we put the new capacitors on. So, you know, get ready with your toothbrush and your isopropyl alcohol to get all of that off, because that's, you know, that's just awful. Now we do have another little job to do here as well, and that is we need to remove the little daughter card, which I'm not sure if I can that's the edge of it there. It's very hard obviously to see because we're looking at a microscope here, but on the other side you'll find a sort of row of pins along here, just to give you some perspective here. So this is the board, this is where all of that big cluster of capacitors were. That's a little daughter card there that I'm just wiggling with my finger, and if you flip that over, you'll see there this little row of pins just there, just along there. Now we've got to get all the solder off those pins so that we can then take that little daughter card out to replace the surface mount components. So I've just got this running along this way, and once again I'm going to be using my trusty solder wick, and I will lay it across here and then just look to soak up all this solder as we go. Yoink, yoink. Okay, looking good, looking good. Might need to come at it from the top angle as well, just to try and get as much of the solder off, because the more solder you get off, the easier it'll be to remove. Actually, it doesn't look too bad here, so if I just give these a bit of a nudge with the soldering iron here, just to push them away from the solder. Oh, there, bent one, that's good. There we go. Right, so I think they're all free now. If I give this a bit of a wiggle from the other side, yeah, so you can see that's me wiggling it there. So let's flip him over, and I'll grab that and give it a bit of a pull, and off she comes. So there's that little daughter card there. So put that to one side, and then we can then have a look at this, and you can see there's our two surface mount electrolytic capacitors, the ones we're used to seeing all the time, and they will need to be replaced as well. So I'll put this board to one side. Next thing I need to do is clean up all of these pads here for the new pins to go in. So once again, I'm going to do that now, but I'm not going to bore you with having to watch that whole thing. Okay, so I have finished cleaning all of those pads up. The next thing we have to do is clean the board. So this board is going to need to get cleaned up with a bit of isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush, so that it gets all spotlessly clean and ready for new capacitors to go on there. So we'll put that to one side for the moment, and we'll now look at our little daughter card thingy. Okay, so nothing particularly new here. We've got to remove some surface mount electrolytic capacitors, and those who know my other videos know that I like to do those with a bit of a surge of hot air. So hot air. And all that. Oh, I just blew away a component. There's a very good argument for not using hot air for this, because sometimes you can blow away a component like I just did. So step number one will be to put that component back on, and I'm going to be doing that by first of all cleaning up the pads, because if it comes off, clean the pads. Simple as that. Get a little bit of flux. Clean. There we go. go. Look at those squeaky clean pads. How good do they look? My gum. Some of the finest pads I've ever seen. Alright. Back goes our component. Boom. Come on. Stay. There you go. Actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put some flux on it. That will help the component stay in place. There we go. On she goes. Just like that. And I'm going to get some solder onto the end of my soldering iron and hold this in place. There's two. Spin him around the other way, and there's three. Okay. Disaster averted. He's back on. Everybody's happy. But there was a lesson learned from that, and that lesson is that I need to turn the speed of the air down on a hot air gun. Now, of course, I could do this without a hot air gun. I could use a bit of wick to, I could use a little bit of wick on these pins to try and suck the solder away and then try and lift them off. I could go with the method that some people talk about, and that is to just twist them and pull them off, but I would never ever do that in a million years, so no, I won't do that. There we go, off she comes. No more lost components, isn't that good? Around to this one. Some more hot air. And off she comes. Okay, so that's all of our, well, our two surface mount electrolytic capacitors off. This is super scungy and will need to be cleaned, but that's the same as with obviously any of the logic boards that I do. Everything needs to be cleaned. So let's start with these pads. Oh. Adding some fresh solder. This is a really crappy board, by the way. It's not made very well. You can just tell when you're working with it. It's just a single layer, and it's kind of cruddy. So let's try and get that as clean as I can. Same with these two. Okay, really does not have to be perfect. Okay, so we've got those ones all ready to go. You may notice there are no markings on this, so it's very important that you either record the location and polarity of those beforehand, or you use my cheat sheet, which has a little daughter board down the bottom here and the power supply at the top there. So okay, so this one now needs to be well, actually, sorry, I need to put the new capacitors onto this one. So we've got two. We have a 100 microfarad 6.3 volt, which is a very common size on the Macs, 100 microfarad 6.3. But the one that we have, which is a little bit rarer, is a 33 microfarad 25 volt. So we need to I'll put the big one on first. So there's flux onto there. Let's drop him on. The positive is on the left there, so put him like that. And as usual, a normal process. Get some solder on the end of the soldering iron. Hold them in place. And yeah, push him down at the top. There we go. He's on. Nice and solid on one side. Spin him around. It's a very easy board to manage, this one, because he's so small. And get some more solder on the end of the soldering iron. Bim. And melt. Alright, he's on. So just double check, nice and solid. Now we do this one. This one is, the positive is facing to the right here. We put some on he goes. Boop, 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 boop. It's a bit crammed in here. Got it on that. And this way. Solder on the soldering iron, and there we go. All right, so that one is on nice and solid. So that one is now recapped. That's our little tiny daughter board recapped. So he's all good to go. And so he just needs a clean. I'm going to do him in the ultrasonic, but obviously you could use a toothbrush and a bit of isopropyl alcohol. And then I need to get the board clean as well. So I'm going to do that now. Once again, I'm not going to bore you with that process, but the next time you see this, it will be squeaky clean. Well, as close as I can get it to squeaky clean. Okay, so I've managed to clean up a fair bit of that gunk around under those capacitors there, so that's looking pretty good. And then this is the little tiny little daughter board thingy, and as you can see, that's come up looking pretty good as well. It's not perfect, but it is good enough. Okay, so now all I have to do is put the new capacitors in. I'm going to start off with this little guy here. The board basically has the positive marked on it, so you just need to make sure that the stripe on the capacitor, which is negative, goes onto the other side. So the other thing on the board, if we have a look here, you can see there's a little dot. If I just do that, let me just point to it. So there is a little dot just here, and that dot indicates the negative. So we've got the positive indicated here, and then the dot indicated with that negative. So now I'm going to feed that through, and then I flip the board over, just bend these pins a little bit so that they don't fall out, and then solder it on. Right, so get my solder, and melt it on. Yeah, like that. Nice and tidy. Then what I'll often do is once I've got one pin soldered, I'll then just push the capacitor from the other side just to make sure it's on there nice and snug. Okay, and then solder onto this side. Right, and that's our first capacitor all done. We're now just got to trim these pins just like that. Right, so that is our first capacitor soldered into place, and then I'm basically just going to go through that process another 9 times. I'll just do this one, 4.7 400 volt, which I have here somewhere. There we go. Here's a little 4.7 400 volt, and once again we put the negative where the little dot is, and the positive where the positive is labelled. In that goes. Shove them down in there, hold them in place, bend the pins, then I'm going to, I might hold that there and just solder it there. I don't really need the microscope for this. Let's face it, it's not that hard, not that small. Okay, so then we just solder that, and then, as before, I then just press the capacitor from the other side, apply some heat just to allow me to get it flush. That's good, that's now flush. And then solder the other side. There we go. There we go. I do one more, just one more, and then I will do the rest in fast motion. And the one more I'm going to do is the 100 microfarad 25 volt, which goes just here. So there we go, 100 microfarad 25 volt. Positive on the positive side. Push that down, bend the pins. And snip, snip. Okay, so now I'm going to do the rest, but I'm going to do the rest in fast motion so that it's not quite so boring. Okay, that is it. That's all of the capacitors and all the new capacitors in place. So all that now remains is to put our little daughter card back in place. Now this basically sits just next to these two capacitors here, and it sits with the components facing that way. So he goes in like this, get the little pins lined up and everything, and then I've got to hold it in place because otherwise it's going to fall out, and then I just need to get some solder onto one of those pins. Now, how am I going to do that without it falling out? A couple of ways you can do it. Number one is you can bend a couple of these pins over to hold them in position, which I don't like doing because I hate bending pins, but you know, it's the easiest way of doing it. So, oh, not bent enough. There we go, they're bent. Now I'm going to jump across to the microscope now, and we will get these all done. Okay, working our way along. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8, 9, 10. And that's it, we're done. That's our little daughter board all back in place, sitting there merrily. So basically all that really remains now is to put it back together and test it. So we're basically going to go through the process we went through before of the disassembly in the other direction. Now, I tried to clean this up as best as I could. There was a little bit of nastiness down in the corner here. So this basically now needs to go in here this way. Now, as I mentioned before, this little component here sits flush on the metal chassis here on the inside, and it's designed to transfer the heat from this component onto this chassis to use the chassis as a heat sink. Now, this originally had a little bit of thermal compound on there to help it make a better flush contact with this metal. So I'm going to do the same. I've got some thermal compound here somewhere. I wouldn't use your really fancy stuff that you use for your CPUs. Just some fairly inexpensive thermal compound will be fine. And all we really need to do is just get a little smear of that on to that there. There we go. That's probably a bit more than is needed, but you know, that's life. And then I'm just going to smoosh that around a little bit. Smoosh, smoosh, smoosh. There we go. Right. And then we need to put this inside here. And obviously this little plug needs to go in as well. So I'm going to, as we discovered before on removing it, it is a little bit, takes a little bit of finagling to get it in, and I'm getting thermal compound everywhere. But let's just keep working it through. I've got to spin this around because unfortunately I can't see. There we go. Look at that. In it goes. And then we've got our plug, and we're going to feed that in position. There we go. There we go. It's coming through. There. Okay, so we've got our two little holes there. Now, if you can get your hand around on this side, you know, give it a push. But it's, you know, it's actually relatively easy to just grab it and pull it, and then it comes out, and then those little flaps come out, and they're now holding that in place. So, I hope I've still got a little bit of thermal compound on that thing. I didn't end up with all of it on my fingers. And then we just need to do pretty much everything we did before in reverse. The next thing we need to do is put in the 3 screws that hold the board to the chassis here. So I'm going to grab my screws. We've got that one hidden right down here in the under all the wires. That's that one done up. And then we've got our 2 up this end here, there and there. Let's do that one. And do that one. Okay, so that's the board securely in position again. And then we need to use the little clamp here. We've got this little clamp to hold that component flush against the case here, the metal case. So just gotta, I'll do this with tweezers. There's a little hole. So there's a little kind of jutty out bit there, and then there's a little hole just there. See, there's the hole there. And we're coming at it from the other side. So we put this just there like that. I'm not sure if that can be seen. Can that be seen just there? No, just there like that. Then I'm just going to hold that in place with my finger, and then I can grab the screw and screw it in to the thing I'm holding with my finger. There we go. And that little clamp, it just holds down there, holds that little component flush up against the board, and then obviously the thermal compound will make good thermal contact with that. So we'll just get that done up nice and tight. And then last of all is of course our good old doohickey. So the doohickey goes here. Just get my screw, feed that through this hole here, and then feed it through the doohickey, and then our little nut on the other side. I'll just hold that in place there. Screw that in while I'm holding the nut, and tighten that up, and he's in place. So that's the board back in place, that's our plug back in place, that's our little components attached to the side of the chassis there, and then we have our plugs. They need to go back in. Obviously probably the sensible thing to do would be to plug the plug in first. This plug can only go on one way because there's a little spacer between two of the pins, so it's impossible to actually put that in the wrong way. So we're going to put that onto the plug there, and then we can get this and just line it up. Come on, here you go. I'm getting caught on something here. Come on. There we go. When you get it in at the right angle, it goes in nice and easy. So that's okay, so that's in there. Then we've got our little screw here. We put that in. So we're basically just doing everything we did at the beginning, but in reverse order. Screw that in. Okay, and there we go. So that is, that's all sort of, pretty much all assembled. Just need to put the cover on the top. So that goes, we've got these two little hooky bits here, and they just hook into these two little holes here. So just sort of do that there like that, then close it down like that, and then we got that last screw that just goes there. In we go. Come on. There we go. Okay, so that's done up. So that is now a recapped 2SI power supply. Now, I'm not actually, it's not connected up to a 2SI at the moment, but I can always throw some power at it and make sure it doesn't blow up. Well, I've connected power to it, it hasn't blown up, so that's always a good sign. So the next step will be to connect it up to a 2SI and see if it works. And hopefully I don't blow up my 2SI. Okay, so here is my 2SI. It has my recapped power supply in it. I am now going to connect it up to some power. And I'm going to move my microphone close so that it's near the speaker, which is down here. And then I'm going to press the power button. 3, 2, 1. And there it is. So that's a successful recap of the power supply, supplying power to the 2SI, starting up well. So that is basically it. So thanks for watching.